Dr. Kahl, we want the war to end quickly and on Ukraine's terms. You stated in your testimony that our goal is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for future negotiations. Within the 5-year near-term focus areas, how is the department working with industry to maximize production in support of Ukraine and in backfilling our defense stocks that have been leveraged to date?
Thank you for that. So DoD is working with industry to increase production of certain capabilities to continue meeting the needs of Ukrainian forces while ensuring that the United States is ready to defend itself and our allies and partners, and this is that balancing act. And DoD has identified over $2 billion of industrial base investments to increase and or accelerate production of things like Javelin, Stinger, HIMARS, these guided multiple launch rocket systems, 155 millimeter artillery shells, and Patriot missiles. And we're also trying to make the best use of the multi-year authorities that Congress has given to us to make sure that we're getting after the munitions challenges more broadly.
Thank you. Dr. Kahl, while we hope for a quick end to this conflict, we must plan, obviously, for the long term. How do the 5 focus areas evolve over time, and what long efforts can we start planning for deployment in the long term to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs for continued defense against Russia that doesn't seem like it is going to go away?
Well, you know, as the president has said, we're in it for as long as it takes. You know, Putin's theory of success is that he can outlast everybody, outlast the Ukrainians, outlast the United States, outlast NATO and the rest of the world. We're going to prove that that's just the latest of a string of miscalculations by Putin. I think, as Lieutenant General Sims noted, what we have prioritized has adjusted across the course of the war. So in the initial period of the war, when it was essential for Ukraine to win the Battle of Kyiv and to use systems they could get right now, right away, we emphasized anti-armor systems like Javelin, man-portable air defense systems, loitering munitions, drones, Soviet legacy ammunition, artillery, and air defense systems. As the conflict shifted to the east, we focused on NATO standard artillery systems and also providing them HIMARS and the GIMLRs. This winter, we have focused on more advanced air defense systems, so think NASAMS, Patriot, but also armored and mechanized systems to help them change the dynamic going into the spring and summer. And so we will continue that process as we move forward, as Ukraine's needs change. And I do think it is incumbent upon all of us to think about what Ukraine needs over the medium term to make sure they can defend whatever territory they claw back from the Russians and deter the Russians from going at it again when and if there's a halting to the fighting or a peace settlement, or even if there isn't. And so the department is focused on constantly iterating on that analysis.
Do you think we're succeeding to that end?
I think we are. Look, I think that if we're all honest with ourselves about where we thought things would be a year ago when Russia launched this invasion, I think it was a pretty dire, pessimistic assessment. And while I don't know how the war is going to end, I think we already know one conclusion for sure, which is that Russia has lost. Russia has lost. They intended to take over all of Ukraine. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen. They intended to divide NATO. NATO is stronger. They intended for Russia to emerge out of this war a great power in a multipolar world. They will emerge from this conflict a shattered military power. And so, again, I don't know exactly where the final lines will be drawn when this conflict comes to a close, but I know our policy has been successful in keeping a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine alive and ensuring that Vladimir Putin suffers a loss.
Thank you, Dr. Kahl. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Storch, you're our watchdog. Ukraine has a corruption problem, right?
There's a long history of issues with corruption in Ukraine.
Infrastructure minister arrested for stealing $400,000. Deputy head of Zelensky's office can't explain where the sports cars came from, so he had to resign. Deputy defense minister resigned over contracting corruption, but the defense ministry put out a statement that his resignation was a worthy deed. And the wife of a former Ukrainian politician was found with $22 million in cash crossing the border into Hungary last year. It seems as though a lot of the zeal for enforcement of the anti-corruption efforts seems to align with the Republican control of the House of Representatives in our country. Maybe that's a coincidence. But let's get to this end-use monitoring you testified to. The Arms Control Act of 1996 requires end-use monitoring for certain defense articles that are sold or leased, right?
Correct.
And there's no feature of anything we've passed that exempts what we've given to Ukraine from those requirements in the Arms Control Act, right?
Not exempts. There are different provisions as to how that plays
But
out
that
in
is
different
controlling
circumstances.
law, controlling policy. And here's the upshot. As you testify here today, you cannot testify, truthfully under oath, that the DOD has complied with the policy and law regarding end-use monitoring during all times of this conflict. Isn't that right?
So I want to be careful here when I respond to you, Congressman, to make sure that I'm clear. We are conducting a series of evaluations that look at the controls that DOD has in place to ensure that they are taking the steps that are required.
I get all that, but here's the operative question. We haven't complied with end-use monitoring according to the law with everything we've sent to Ukraine to date, have we?
So our 2020 report, which is our last public report on this, made a number of recommendations. All of those have been met.
I know, but you're sort of dodging the question. You cannot testify that we have complied with the end-use monitoring requirements at all times during this conflict, can you?
So we have an ongoing evaluation
I
right
get that it's
now.
ongoing. I'm looking backwards. You cannot testify that everything is complied with the law and the end-use monitoring, can you?
So some of that gets into the classified report that we issued previously.
But I think everyone watching this can see that if you could testify to that, you would. You're citing a classified report. I don't know why that report's classified. I think the American people deserve to know if this 1996 law is being followed or not. You can't testify that it is being followed, and so I think they can draw reasonable conclusions from that. Do we have, Dr. Kahl, do we have DOD personnel in Ukraine now?
We do. We have a couple dozen at the embassy.
Other than the embassy, any other personnel?
Nope.
How about CIA? Are they training folks in Ukraine?
I'm not going to talk about that in an unclassified setting. Happy to talk about that further in the classified briefing.
Is the Azov battalion getting access to U.S. weapons?
Not that I'm aware of, but if you have information,
I seek
happy to
unanimous
share it.
consent to enter into the record the Global Times investigative report that talks about training. It's from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, citing that the Azov Battalion was even getting stuff as far back as 2018.
Without objection, so ordered.
Any reason to disagree with that assessment, Dr.
Is this
Kahl?
I'm sorry, is this the Global Times from China?
No, this is,
That's what you read.
yeah, it might be. Yeah, would that be a reason?
As a general matter, I don't take Beijing's
Well,
propaganda.
no,
at
yeah,
face
but just tell me
value.
if the allegation is true or false. I mean,
I don't have any evidence one way or the other. As a general matter, I don't take Beijing's propaganda at face value.
fair enough. I would agree with that assessment. April 2022, President Biden is describing the supplemental funding that we're providing to Ukraine. He says, quote, "It's also going to help schools and hospitals open. It's going to allow pensions and social support to be paid to the Ukrainian people so they have something in their pocket." So help me understand how U.S. taxpayers paying for pensions in Ukraine is a good idea for our country.
I would defer you to other parts of our government. The Department of Defense doesn't have a role in pensions in Ukraine.
You're a senior Biden administration official. The president said that it's really important that we keep funding the pensions in Ukraine. I would observe that the U.S. Census Bureau says that in 2022, the U.S. pension shortfall is $1.4 trillion. So while we have a corrupt Ukrainian government, while we have our watchdog here who can't say that we followed the law on end-use monitoring, we have the President of the United States saying we need to fund pensions in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the pensions of our fellow Americans are in greater jeopardy. Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired, but I seek unanimous consent to enter a number of articles into the record, if I may.
Without objection, so ordered.
Very well.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Kahl, one of the experts who I was talking to told me that Russia has 6 times the artillery as Ukraine. Is that true?
Not anymore. I think the reality is that we don't know precisely how much artillery Russia has left, but we do know that they have expended an extraordinary amount of it and that they are running low, which is why they're turning to the likes of North Korea and others in desperate search of more artillery.
Where would you put the ratio at now?
It's hard to say. We could talk more about this precisely in the classified setting, and a lot of it also depends on the assumptions you make about the viability of ammunition that Russia has had in storage for 40 or 50 years, going back to the Soviet days, so it's a little bit of an art rather than a science. I do think the Russians continue to have artillery, but they are suffering tremendous shortages at the front of artillery, which is why they're turning to countries like North Korea.
And as someone who deeply admires the president's policy and Tony Blinken's role, your role, and has voted for all the aid packages, I guess my question is, what is your confidence level at this point that Ukraine will be able to hold all the territory it currently holds in a war of attrition?
I think that, as Lieutenant General Sims has testified, the front line right now is kind of a grinding slog, and you're likely to see incremental gains on both sides. So, for example, the Russians have made some incremental gains around Bakhmut in recent weeks and months, but at the cost of thousands and thousands of casualties in these human wave attacks from the Wagner prisoners and others. So you may see small portions of territory change hands in the coming weeks and months. I do not think that there's anything I see that suggests the Russians can sweep across Ukraine and make significant territorial gains anytime in the next year or so. And we are making sure the Ukrainians have the capabilities to stop them from doing that,
and
while at the same time giving them the capabilities to go on the offensive themselves to claw back more territory.
And I assume, Dr. Kahl, your assumption is contingent on the House continuing to support Ukraine with aid, or are you saying already with what we've given?
No, I mean, well, so first of all, the House, the Senate, the American people have been extraordinarily generous. We've spent about $31.7 billion in security assistance over the last year. We have about $12 billion remaining from the money that you all provided at the end of last year for the remainder of this fiscal year. It is true that Ukraine continues to depend on assistance from the United States and our allies and partners, and that will be true for some period of time. So yes, if the world walked away from Ukraine, then the balance would tip in Russia's favor, but there is no reason to believe.
And how many more rounds of aid do you expect? And I say this as someone who supported him and wants to continue to support him, but just in terms of the American public, how many more times do you think Congress needs to provide aid?
You know, it's difficult, and it's difficult because we don't know the course and trajectory of the conflict. The conflict could end 6 months from now. It could end 2 years from now or 3 years from now. I think the president has said that the United States will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. I think we've had a good conversation today about why that's in the vital national interest of the United States. So I would hope that Congress would continue to be supportive. But we should only come and ask for what Ukraine really needs, and as this conversation has said, what we can account for and demonstrate to the American people is actually benefiting our interests.
And what do you think at the end is the end game? I mean, obviously we talk about a just peace. What does that look like to you, and how do we get there?
Well, of course, Ukraine has detailed its principles for a just peace. We just had more than 140 countries in the UN General Assembly essentially ratify their approach. I think a just peace would involve Russia withdrawing from the territory that they have illegally occupied from Ukraine. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are going to be the ones that determine what peace settlement is acceptable or not. Our position has been to make sure that at whatever point they enter into those conversations, they do so from a position of strength.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kahl, did we successfully deter Russia from invading Ukraine? Did deterrence work? We had a whole series of diplomatic, economic sanctions, the most powerful sanctions the world has ever seen, not to mention our ongoing security assistance at the time. Did that work? Was it successful?
Clearly, because he invaded Ukraine, Putin was not deterred.
So it's safe to say deterrence failed in this case.
Well, one possibility is also that Putin was not deterrable as it related to going into Ukraine. He has been deterred as it relates to going after the United States or NATO.
So you would postulate that no matter what we provided Ukraine, deterrence would have failed?
I actually think our intelligence community is split on this view. Their assessment was that almost no amount of weapons prior to the conflict could have deterred Putin from going into Ukraine.
Well, I asked this in the sense that I was in Ukraine the month before. And at the time, the answer that the Ukrainians were receiving, that we received, was that Stingers, too escalatory, anti-ship missiles, too provocative, long-range artillery, certainly off the books and improbable. Other things will take too long to train on. And what we've seen is Stingers too provocative, then we provide them. Harpoons too provocative, then we provide them. HIMARS can't do that, then we give them. Patriots, absolutely not, then we give them. Tanks, Bradleys, heck no, takes too long. Now here we are a year later, we're providing them. I think, as we're patting ourselves on the back, providing an ally the arms they need to defend themselves, if we've decided it's within our interest after entire cities and whole regions have been devastated, probably isn't a good strategy. Would you agree with that?
Well, we did provide hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance in the months leading up to the war. And then, of course, Congress...
Actually, if we really rewind the clock, starting in 2014, we provided only non-lethal aid until 2017. Was that a mistake?
Well, I was then National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden, and he favored providing lethal assistance like javelins. That's everybody knows that.
And the Obama administration
made a different decision.
Was that a mistake?
I think in retrospect, we should have provided them Javelin missiles. That's been the position of then Vice President Biden.
The Trump administration then provided.
It was a complicated tale,
right.
I think, as you
So
recall from the transcript.
Let's move to burden sharing, because I think this is absolutely an issue I hear from my constituents and something we need to address as a policy matter. The United States provided $30 billion in security assistance. The next nearest is Germany at 3.5, a tenth of what we've provided. UK less than $3 billion, France less than $1 billion. They're in the 100 millions. And poor Estonia has provided 3 times, just by percentage of GDP, what France has provided. So all in total, even though our economies of the EU and the United States roughly the same, the Europeans have provided less than half of what we have. And we haven't even gotten into the rest that makes up the full $100 billion. Is that fair? Is that effective burden sharing?
Well, obviously, we've been working with our allies and partners throughout, and the Secretary of Defense has held now 9 of these Ukraine defense contact groups. They meet monthly.
No, I understand.
I'm going to answer your question. If you actually take the top 20 contributors of security assistance to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP, the United States ranks 10th. And there are a number of European countries that are above the bar. You mentioned Estonia. Latvia is also up there, but countries like Poland, Finland, Norway, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Sweden are all above us as a percentage of GDP. And then some of the countries that you mentioned are below us.
But I'm talking about right on the front lines, clearly in their interest, Germany in particular. What have we done to get Germany and France and Italy and these large economies clearly in the heart of NATO, in the heart of Europe, and directly, if we buy into the matter that this is in our interest because if Putin slices through Ukraine, he'll keep going. What have we done effectively to get them to step up to the plate, at least dollar for dollar, dollar for euro?
I think the Defense Department has certainly worked alongside the White House and the State Department on diplomacy in this regard from the very beginning. That's why the Secretary of Defense holds these monthly meetings. They started in Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The Germans, as of now, have provided $3.58 billion. The UK has provided $2.85 billion.
I read out the statistics. Yeah. I would just postulate, going forward, over the long term, just as we had in the Gulf War, where we had an effective diplomatic effort to pay for this, that this is a global issue.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair,
I think we need to do a lot more to get Europe to step up.
Minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for having this hearing on an ongoing basis on an important issue of oversight. This is an all-government approach that we have here. Secretary Yellen is in Ukraine right now, and we do have sanctions that no country has ever seen before. In terms of your area, particularly Mr. Storch, or for anyone that's here, some of those new sanctions, how helpful will they be in terms of the people that are trying to skirt those existing sanctions and get around them, and how helpful will they be in the overall effort?
Well, I'll just start from the oversight perspective. We have this working group. Part of the working group is the Department of Treasury OIG, so it's probably more a question for them than for the DoD OIG, because we have oversight over the security assistance. In terms of the policy decision, that's not really sort of what OIGs do, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Kahl.
I'll just say, I think obviously the sanctions have put a dent in the Russian economy. We'll continue to magnify that. I think from a DoD perspective, the bigger constraint on the Russians is more likely to be the export controls, which are making it very difficult for Russia to recapitalize the military that has been shattered in Ukraine.
Okay. Just a quick question. Does Germany have different laws than we do in terms of their defense?
I mean, all the allies and partners we work with have different constraints, different laws. You know, Germany was not, one of the reasons we didn't provide lethal assistance back in the Obama administration was because Germany was so opposed to doing it. So the fact that they provide any lethal assistance was a huge sea change for them. Now, I know that's frustrating for a lot of folks who want our allies and partners to do the most they can. We share that desire. But yes, our allies and partners all have their own domestic political constraints, their own domestic regulations, and a lot of them have had to change their own laws and practices in order to provide the historic support for Ukraine that we've seen.
Okay. The question, you know, when we read something in the newspaper regarding someone being dismissed from a position in Ukraine and being replaced, you know, this is a sovereign issue that each country has. They make their own decisions. But just a question, and I want to do this so we can avoid classified setting, just a question generally. If those decisions are made and they do deal with something that would be a concern in our oversight and everything, is that communicated to the U.S. and their allies informally?
I would say sometimes we're aware of the moves before they happen, and sometimes we're aware when we read about them, just like you do. I think the point from our matter of U.S. policy is that the importance of getting after corruption in Ukraine or anywhere else is at the top of our points of emphasis with Ukrainian leaders. I do think they are taking these issues seriously. I think it's a problem they're going to continue to work on, but the fact that they're making any progress in the midst of this existential fight, I think, is quite remarkable, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Storch, just an observation. I was a prosecutor before I was a member of Congress. And, you know, when there's a line of questioning that occurs, and your job is one of monitoring and an ongoing investigation, whether something's there or not, but you're in the process of doing it, and you're asked a question publicly about what the outcome of that might be before it ever occurs. That must put you in a very difficult position to answer a question, and it might give the perception you're not answering the question when indeed you're not able to answer the question if you're doing your job properly. You want to comment on sometimes on the difficulty of that line of questioning when it's posed in a public setting like it is here?
I appreciate very much the observation, and that's exactly right, obviously. You know, our job in the IG community is to do independent oversight, and as an old boss of mine used to say, we hit it right down the fairway. I can't do that in golf, but my office does that in oversight. And so we're looking at these issues, we're trying to determine what happens, and we're going to report out as transparently as we can, but to try to get ahead of an ongoing audit or evaluation or to talk about, I can't even begin to speculate about investigations, puts us in a very difficult position. So I appreciate the sensitivity. If I can on corruption, I'd just add, when I was over in Kyiv, that was one of the things we really emphasized, both myself and my counterparts from the other two OIGs, and we met with everybody up to the Prime Minister and down the Minister of Defense and others, the importance of ensuring that corruption was being addressed and that we're being transparent about it. They all said they understood that. Now, obviously, as a career prosecutor at an IG, you know, we're in the trust but verify business, but certainly they indicated that they understand that issue. And finally, I just add that sort of in one of life's coincidences, I actually previously worked in Ukraine as a resident legal advisor for the Department of Justice, working on anti-corruption issues. So I hope that perspective helps my office as we look at what's going on here.
I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kahl, you helped write the dangerous Obama-era Iran deal, the JCPOA. You helped negotiate it. Last November, President Biden was caught on video saying the deal was dead
Yet just this month, the administration has renewed sanctions waivers that are key to the deal. Why, in your opinion, is the Biden administration so hell-bent on reentering the new Iran deal?
Thank you for your question. Just as a technical matter, I was not involved in the negotiation of the Iran deal.
You helped write it.
I didn't,
Fair?
but
You were involved with it.
well, I worked in the administration when the deal was negotiated. The President and Secretary Blinken and others in the administration have made clear that we're not about to re-enter the JCPOA anytime soon.
Why did they attempt to re-enter it?
Well, because Iran's nuclear progress since we left the JCPOA has been remarkable. Back in 2018, when the previous administration decided to leave the JCPOA, it would have taken Iran about 12 months to produce one bomb's worth of fissile material. Now it would take about 12 days. And so I think there is still the view that if you can resolve this issue diplomatically and put constraints back on their nuclear program, it is better than the other options. But right now, the JCPOA is on ice because there was an arrangement on the table last summer that the Iranians were not willing to take. And of course, Iran's behavior has changed since then, not the least of which their support for Russia in Ukraine, which is the subject of the conversation here today. So I don't think we're on the precipice of re-entering the JCPOA.
So you're declaring defeat for the new Iran deal on behalf of the Biden administration?
I think our view, actually, I'm just stating what both the President and the Secretary of State have already said, which is that the JCPOA is not on the horizon in the near term. The administration's position remains that a diplomatic deal to put constraints around Iran's program remains the best alternative to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But the President has also made clear that his policy is that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, period, and that if a diplomatic outcome is not possible, that we have other options to deal with that problem.
So does it concern you that Putin and China are on the side of negotiating the same deal that you helped craft during the Obama administration?
There are no active P5+1 negotiations, so China and Russia being at the table or not being at the table are not terribly
Can you
germane.
shed light for us on why we tapped Russians to help negotiate on America's behalf in the renewed negotiations during the Biden administration?
It's not clear to me what you're referencing, but I think that during the Obama administration, at least, the Russians were able to compartmentalize differences that we had in some areas and the common view of not wanting Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I think we're not in the same place right now because the Russians, because of how badly they're doing in Ukraine, are becoming increasingly dependent on Iran, and therefore I think are a lot less likely to put pressure of any kind on Iran to accede to any diplomatic agreement because they're trying to get Iran to ship them more drones, missiles, and other capabilities.
In 2021, did you expect the invasion of Ukraine?
In 2021, well, in 2021 we warned the world about, I'm sorry?
You expected it? You anticipated it?
Beginning in
the
the
invasion?
fall, I think it's of public record. Beginning in the fall, we had very good intelligence that Vladimir Putin was putting the pieces in place to be able to carry out a large-scale invasion. We began to downgrade, declassify, and share that information with the world in the fall of 2021.
Then why, shed light for us, then why did the Biden administration lift sanctions on Nord Stream 2 if we anticipated it?
Well, I think the timelines are different in those. You should correct me if the record is different. I believe the Nord Stream conversations were several months before. And largely that was in order to stay united with Germany, but also to give us a leverage point. In fact, what's interesting is that had that not gone forward, the ability of Germany to then essentially walk away from the deal would not have been effective punishment or leverage over the Russians. But these were not linked in time.
In hindsight, should we regret that decision to lift those sanctions?
You know, I work at the Defense Department. I wasn't involved in any of those deliberations, so I'd really defer those questions to the Treasury Department and the State Department. I don't have an opinion on that conversation. No, I don't.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thanks.
Chair now recognizes a gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been a staunch advocate for providing support to Ukraine since President Putin's unjustified invasion just about a year ago. Given my past in the Air Force, it probably isn't a shock to anyone that I'm particularly advocating for the transfer of American aircraft. In fact, I started doing that in April of last year, and most recently in a letter with my colleagues from the Four Country Caucus. We asked President Biden to transfer specifically F-16 aircraft to the Ukrainian military, as President Zelensky requested. I understand that on Friday that President Biden said in an interview that Ukraine, quote, doesn't need F-16s now, and on Sunday, NSA advisor Jake Sullivan emphasized that, quote, F-16s are a question for a later time. Last year, I also proudly co-led a bill with our former colleague, Rep. Kinzinger, to authorize funding to provide training for Ukrainian fighter pilots, recognizing that, of course, training may need to happen before they are ready to fly our jets, and in the event that we ultimately do transfer them. We submitted this language for inclusion in last year's NDAA, and the final law included that language authorizing the United States to provide training for Ukrainian soldiers, both on manned and unmanned aerial capabilities, including tactical surveillance systems and fixed and rotary aircraft, such as attack, strike, airlift, and surveillance aircraft. So my 2 or 3 questions for you. Undersecretary Kahl, in your written testimony, you noted that you have expanded U.S.-led training of Ukrainian air forces on combined arms and joint maneuver operations. Could you speak to whether or not this training included aircraft such as authorized by the fiscal year 23 NDAA? That's my first question. My second question also for you is, what exactly would a later time be, as you know, quoted by President Biden? And we may finally have to save this for our classified briefing, but could you please elaborate on what information the President is relying on, or perhaps was relying on, when he said that Ukraine doesn't need F-16s now, despite pleas from Ukraine's own president?
Thank you for that. So, no, we have not started training on F-16s. Our assessment is that a delivery timeline for F-16s, even on the most expeditious timeline, and the training timelines are essentially the same. That is, they're about 18 months. And so you don't actually save yourself time by starting the training early in our assessment. And since we haven't made the decision to provide F-16s, and neither have our allies and partners, it doesn't make sense to start to train them on a system they may never get. I mean, they could end up getting British Tornadoes or Gripens or Mirage aircraft, and therefore you wouldn't want to train them on F-16. So it just, in our judgment, is not the appropriate time to start training. It is true that the President has, and the National Security Advisor have said that, you know, we don't see F-16s as the top priority right now. The President did have this conversation with President Zelensky in Kyiv last week. It is a priority for the Ukrainians, but it's not one of their top 3 priorities. Their top priorities are air defense systems, that is keeping their interceptors and air defense network alive against Russian cruise missiles and Iranian drones, artillery and fires, which we've talked about, and armor and mechanized systems. A couple of just data points on F-16s that I think actually speaks to your second and third questions. We've looked at this very carefully about what it would take to get Ukraine F-16s. So if we were to do new production, it would take 3 to 6 years to get them F-16s. We could look at older block F-16s that could potentially deliver on a faster timeline. Let's call it 18 to 24 months. Maybe you can even shave a few months off of that. Then the question would be, how many? The Ukrainians have at times asked us for as many as 128 fourth-generation aircraft, a mix of F-15s, F-18s, and F-16s. Our Air Force estimates that over the long term, Ukraine would probably need 50 to 80 F-16s to replace their existing Air Force. If you did that with new F-16s, so say Block 70, 72s, that would cost $10 or $11 billion. If you did it with older Block 30 or 32 aircraft, and let's imagine you only did half, 36 of those, it would still cost $2 to $3 billion. And just as a reminder, that would consume a huge portion of the remaining security assistance that we have for this fiscal year. So these are the trade-offs that we are making in real time. Would it make sense to spend $3 billion on a capability that will arrive a year and a half from now, when that $3 billion is needed for Patriot interceptors, or more Bradley fighting vehicles, or more 155 millimeter ammunition, or more Gimlers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the trade-offs we're making at the moment.
I'm nearly out of time. I appreciate that. I guess my only concern is when we started talking about this 10 months ago, 10 months has gone by, and so I just don't know when the clock should start. And when we see that this...
Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair now
I appreciate
recognizes
it. I yield back.
the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Very important topic, very timely. I had a couple more questions about the end-use monitoring for Mr. Storch. Your office published a report in October stating that the Department of Defense was unable to provide in-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy because of the limited U.S. presence in Ukraine. So the report identified the challenges that the DoD personnel who are responsible for conducting in-use monitoring and enhanced in-use monitoring face when there is no U.S. personnel present, or at least limited presence there. Have we learned any lessons or discovered any best practices to improve that in-use monitoring in Ukraine despite the lack of people there on the ground?
So to be clear, the report that was issued in October 2022 was a classified report, so happy to talk more in detail about that during the later session. I believe it's accurate to say that what the report did is it acknowledged the challenges that are faced in those circumstances, such as they were in Ukraine, and the steps that were being taken at the time to try to address those. And as I say, happy to talk more. The reason we initiated the current evaluation, and the reason I didn't want to get ahead of what we're finding, is that as the situation changes and conditions on the ground evolve, we want to go back, and we are going back and looking at what's going on now, what steps have been taken to try to adjust those challenges and where they are and how things move forward. And frankly, Congressman, given the importance of the issue, I think that's something we're going to be looking at as long as this goes on, right? And so that's where we are.
And I think we agree we have to do that. We owe it to all involved. And I know that there are classified portions, there probably are unclassified things that you could discuss, but does the department have any concerns about the self-reporting that is coming out of Ukraine? So, you know, specifically, Ukraine, we all know Ukraine has a documented history of corruption and government waste in the past. I know a lot of that has been being alleviated, but what gives you confidence that the Ukrainians are being entirely forthcoming and transparent with us when it comes to what we've seen so far?
So, you know, at some level, that's why we do these audits and reviews, right? Is so we want to look at the evidence and then be able to assess independently where things are. As I mentioned, I went to Kyiv. We met with the Prime Minister. We met with the Minister of Defense. They told us they understood the importance of addressing corruption. When we were out there, actually, coincidentally, a number of corruption cases had been announced. They very strongly pointed out those did not involve U.S. security assistance or U.S. assistance generally. But having said that, they were corruption cases, and the point they were making is they were trying to address them. So as I say, I've got a long history. I've been going out to Ukraine and working out there on behalf of the United States government for more than 15 years and in the anti-corruption area. And so I hear what they're saying, and then we're in the trust but verify business. And the way we do that on this issue is by doing these evaluations that look at what's actually going on. Because again, there's sometimes a misunderstanding. We at the DoD OIG, we don't go out and count the missiles, right? We don't do the monitoring. It's up to the DoD to meet the requirements of the law and the policies that implement it regarding monitoring, and then we do oversight to make sure that's happening, that it's happening in accordance with the law and it's happening appropriately, and we make recommendations to help the DoD to improve that. So that's the process we're engaged in now, and as I say, I think we're going to continue to be engaged in.
There's just some inherent challenges, as we're acknowledging, when we don't have DoD personnel there. So we want to ensure, of course, that sensitive weapons end up where they're supposed to be. Do you think that we need U.S. inspectors on the ground to do that? Or, I mean, we're trust but verify. What are the details of that, I guess?
I'm sorry, do you mean from my office or DoD personnel?
Well, U.S. inspectors.
I can talk to that a little.
Okay.
I can talk to that a little bit. So first of all, we're not just taking the Ukrainians' words for it. They provide us information on their inventories, their transfer logs. We have provided them handheld scanners. That data gets transmitted directly back to us so that we can keep custody. We have shared NATO standard inventory and logistics software, which we also have access to that data. And then, of course, we do have a presence at the embassy. We have an Office of Defense Cooperation, and they have done 6 different site visits out from Kyiv. These are day trips. It's a dangerous place, and we don't have outposts across the country. And they have seen no signs of diversion or that the Ukrainians are not following procedures. So, look, this is an active combat zone, and it's not like Iraq and Afghanistan where we have thousands of soldiers all over the country. So there are inherent restrictions, but we're trying to maximize the use of technology and the people we do have on the ground to get the best site picture as possible. And then, of course, the IG will do oversight to make sure we're doing our job the right way.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I recently met with many of our NATO allies and members of the Ukrainian parliament, and two things really became clear. One is that U.S. leadership has been effective. We have overseen a lot of the support for Ukraine, and our allies appreciate that, as well as our intelligence sharing.
I don't think your microphone's on. Yeah, you might want to borrow Miss Escobar's or Miss Lotkins.
Steal Miss Slotkins.
There you go.
Thank you. I was saying that two things have really become clear. U.S. leadership has been instrumental in this fight, and that has been noted by our allies across the world and appreciated. But sadly, what's also become clear is the broad-scale use of war crimes by the Russians, kidnapping of children, over 6,000 verified cases, and that's simply what we are able to verify. I'd say that's very low. Rape of mothers in front of their children, young children, rape of daughters and mothers, as I'm hearing from my Ukrainian community as they come into the district, targeting of civilian infrastructure. And so it becomes clear, and when you hear from the Ukrainian parliamentarians, you hear that they believe this is an attempt by the Russians to demoralize them, to make them want to quit this fight, when in fact it has had the opposite effect, an understanding of why this fight is so important. And so that is why we on this committee take our job so very seriously, for making sure that we can support Ukraine. And the only way we can continue to do that effectively is with the support of the American people. And so our understanding of the oversight, our understanding of how Ukrainians are overcoming their history of corruption is so important so we can convey it. And I really appreciate your explanation of all of the measures we have in place, but I don't think what is coming through is what I heard when I was on the ground in Kyiv from the embassy, that they are seeing all the weapons that come in get to the front. They are getting pictures of those weapons on the front lines. They are seeing them in use. They feel very confident that the weapons that we provide them at the border of Poland are in fact making it to the front, and we are certainly seeing their effective use time and time again. Can you talk a little bit more about why we believe that the weaponry that we have sent to Ukraine is in fact making it to the front, and how we have not seen we have not seen those weapons, for example, for sale on international markets? And maybe that's a question for Dr. Kahl, because I think, Mr. Storch, you are doing the aftermath of it, but how do we feel right now in time about providing all the assistance we've provided to Ukraine and our confidence that it is actually getting where we want it to go?
So part of it is what we're seeing, and part of it is what we're not seeing. So what we're not seeing is any evidence of significant diversion. I think our assessment is if some of these systems have been diverted, it's by Russians who have captured things on the battlefield, which always happens, but that there's no evidence that the Ukrainians are diverting it to the black market or some other thing else. That's not surprising given the intensity of the fight and the fact that they are clearly using what we are providing them and what our allies and partners are providing them to maximum effect. So they are asking us for more because they are using everything that we have provided them. I would just say as a general matter, you know, the inventory comes in to the various places in Europe where the security assistance flows in. All that inventory is taken note of, it's scanned, et cetera. It gets given to the Ukrainians. They are responsible for giving us the information on where it ends up and the logs of that information, sharing with us digital confirmation of where things go. They also have scanners. That information comes back to us, and they have this NATO standard software that helps keep inventory, which we also have access to that information, and we do these site visits. So look, this is an active war zone. There are always going to be things that you don't know are happening or you don't see, but we are not seeing any evidence of systemic diversion of the equipment that the United States has provided.
Thank you. And in my final few seconds, is there more we could be doing as a committee to support ensuring that the weapons are being used appropriately?
Well, I just say hearings like this are great. I think oversight and transparency is really important. The things that Dr. Kahl talks about, that's the information that we're getting as we have our teams out there doing evaluations, looking at every aspect of the security of this equipment, from the beginning until it gets to the front lines in Ukraine, and to make sure that everything that can be done is being done to ensure that it's being used properly and as intended. So I think hearings like this are great, and we appreciate the committee's support as we do our oversight, and we'll keep you informed as we go forward.
Thank you. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. McClain, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank Mr. Rogers for giving me the opportunity to go on a CODEL and actually see the inventory of weapons that we are sending, and just how they are getting from point A to point B and how we're tracking them. You know, that I can assure you raised my level of confidence. There is a saying, one look is worth 1,000 reports. But I want to shift gears for just a moment, because although I think we're doing some things very well, I think we need a little bit of a reset with the American people, or I should just say my constituents in my district. They've been raising concerns with me about our involvement in this war. They're worried that we're getting dragged into a never-ending war with no clear and precise outcome that has been, in their opinion, right, or perceptions, 90% of reality, that has a clear end in sight. They believe that we're spending money and resources on a fight overseas rather than getting our own fiscal house in order. If you could, and anyone can answer, in simple terms, just lay out to the American people the reasons why it is so important for Ukraine to defeat Russia in this war, particularly from the eyes of the Americans. So what is the implications for the United States if Russia actually does defeat Ukraine?
I think the implications would be both in Europe and felt around the world. You know, the United States did get dragged into 2 world wars in Europe because aggressors weren't stopped. Aggressors, you know, initiated their conflict. The free world didn't hang together. Aggressors weren't deterred. They weren't stopped. And so the United States eventually was dragged into those conflicts. And we don't want to see that happening
so
again.
It's a deterrent, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it's more of a deterrent so we don't end up into a world war.
I think it is to demonstrate to other would-be aggressors that if they engage in the type of aggression that Russia has, they would face similar consequences. And I think it will matter very much, for example, if you're sitting in Beijing wondering about crossing the Taiwan Strait, you will ask yourself, if I do that, will the world react like they did when we went after and absorbed Hong Kong, which was to just kind of look the other way, or the way the world reacted in Ukraine? And if it's the latter, then aggression across the Taiwan Strait's a lot less likely.
And can you expand on that, sir, just a little bit more? What would a Russian victory or defeat mean for China?
Well, I think, first of all, Russia is China's closest ally. They, of course, signed a strategic partnership without limits shortly before the war. We have seen growing indications that China might be considering providing Russia with some assistance, lethal assistance, which would be very troublesome. So China has a stake in the outcome here. But also, I think China would, you know, they speak a lot about the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity, but frankly, China would benefit greatly from a world that allowed big powers to gobble up their small neighbors.
And would you care to comment, what would the loss of Ukraine mean for NATO?
Well, first of all, Ukraine's not going to lose. There will be no loss of Ukraine. I think Vladimir Putin hoped that would happen. It's not. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. Ukraine continues to maintain most of its territory. They're fighting tenaciously. The Russians do not have the capacity, in my view, to take over Ukraine. But obviously, if they were to do so, it would position Russian forces and all the developments inside of Ukraine right on right on NATO's doorstep as it relates to Poland and the Baltic states, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you've seen Poland and the Baltic states so engaged in Ukraine.
And can you talk a little bit about the economic impact that would mean, or that would have on the United States?
Well, I think, you've already seen that Russia's aggression, especially what they've done to limit the ability of grain to get to global markets through the Black Sea, has already had an impact on global security writ large. Obviously, the energy instability, which is generated by the war, has also had an economic consequence. So I think the war is already having significant consequences because of Russia's aggression, and had it been unchecked, I think those consequences would have been worse.
And we'd have been farther along. Thank you. With that time, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my gratitude, Mr. Chairman, to you and the ranking member for these ongoing conversations and this opportunity for us to provide oversight and for the American people to feel comfort, I hope and I believe, with the information that's being delivered. I'd like to thank our witnesses as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't remark on the incredible change that I've seen happen over the last 3 years since I attended the Munich Security Conference in 2019 versus the Munich Security Conference last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was. When I was there in 2019, there was a significant question about the West and whether the West would continue to support NATO, and just the fears about how untethered things seemed. But last week or the week before, whenever it was, sorry, time escapes me, but this year's Munich Security Conference, the incredible unity and the strength demonstrated by our allies and our friends, especially with regard to Ukraine and our defense of democracy. And I'm very proud of the role that the United States has played in rebuilding NATO and ensuring that the West has come together in a way to defend our friends and allies and help stop the Russian aggression. And I'd like to, Dr. Kahl, just in that vein, because there's been just such a lot of conversation, obviously, about the F-16s and about why the United States and some of our friends are not stepping up as quickly as some would like. My colleague, Representative Houlihan, she was about to ask a question, and I'd like to follow that up because I'm curious as well. But when her question, she started as her time ran out, when should the clock start on those F-16s? You laid out for us very clearly and very effectively, the considerations involved and also the financial implications as well. And that's on Congress, right, to make sure that we provide the continued support and to put our money where our mouth is. But when should that clock start ticking for the F-16s? And is that something you can discuss in this setting?
Look, I think it is, a more modernized Ukrainian Air Force will be important in the medium and long term for Ukraine to continue to defend the territory that it claws back and to deter Russia in the future. So I think there is a medium to long-term requirement. The challenge, of course, is even if it was a short-term requirement, we couldn't get it to them immediately anyway, and we don't assess that it is the highest short-term priority. And by the way, neither do the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians' priorities are air defense systems, so they're integrated air and missile defense systems, artillery and fires, armor and mechanized. And because every dollar you spend on one is a dollar you can't spend on another, there are real trade-offs. Obviously, Ukraine is going to continue having conversations with us. As I said, President Zelensky discussed this with President Biden in Kyiv last week. Zelensky has had similar conversations with our UK and French allies. The UK has announced an interest in starting to do some training, so we'll see where that leads. There are other countries in NATO, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, I think, that have talked about potentially F-16s that they may be offloading as they upgrade to F-35s. So I do think this conversation will continue. As I sit in the Pentagon, and I have to say, what does Ukraine need right now to stay in the fight and turn the tide against the Russians in the first half of this year, which I think is going to be decisive for the conflict? It's just hard for me to tell any member of Congress or the American people that the best use of that dollar spent right now is on F-16s.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kahl. And I only have a few seconds left, but I am wondering, in terms of the replenishment of U.S. stocks, is the department looking to utilize critical technologies such as additive manufacturing to fill some of those gaps?
Sorry. I think the short answer is yes, but I think it's probably better for us to arrange a briefing by our acquisitions and sustainment folks to really go through the kind of the multi-layered approach that they're taking to this, because they're the real experts on that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, our aid packages to Ukraine have included light tactical vehicles like Humvees. I've been a staunch supporter of the Humvee upgrade. You know, when we had to retrofit the Humvees because of the risk of IEDs, of course, that made it top heavy, but we have the ABS and the ESC rollover kits that prevent that. You know, we've lost too many men and women to rollovers, and a lot have been injured as well. So at the beginning of this fiscal year, approximately 40,000 Humvees that are either new or like new were in our fleet, hadn't received the anti-rollover technology. And my question for the witnesses is, when we're sending Humvees to the Ukraine, and where are they coming from? And more to the point, are we sending Humvees that have already been fully upgraded with the anti-rollover technology? Or are we sending Humvees that are slated to get this upgrade? Or are they coming from the demilitarized vehicle stockpile?
I might ask General Sims if I don't actually know the answer to that question, but DA may, or we may have to take it to come back to you.
Sure, I will have to come back to you. We'll bring that answer back to you. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, because we have Red River Army Depot that does a lot of this work, and they're starving at the vine, and we've got 40,000, units that need this upgrade, and I'd really like to get that in, because it saves about $12 billion rather than buying brand new ones to retrofit the ones we already have. So we want to always be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So for the witnesses as well, one of the initiatives we've been working on in our office with our colleague, our friend from California, Mr. Panetta, is our Ukraine Human Rights Policy Act, and this legislation would take concrete steps to hold Russia accountable for their atrocities that they're committing in Ukraine. So what evidence of war crimes have you seen in Ukraine, including any committed by the Wagner Group? And as the war rages into its second year, what can be done to hold Russia accountable for their actions? And then what can be done during reconstruction?
I think our colleagues at the State Department would probably be better at cataloging all of the horrors, but we've all seen it. There's been a systematic targeting of civilians in Ukraine, clearly a callous disregard for civilian welfare. But this winter, the targeting of critical infrastructure, literally intending to starve and freeze tens of millions of people for no military purpose other than to try to compel the Ukrainians to give up. But certainly in violation of the laws of armed conflict. We've seen Russian troops engage in terrible atrocities, killing civilians, killing detained forces. And of course, we've also seen the deportation of Ukrainian children back to Russia, which is among the most heinous of war crimes.
Doctor, how many are we talking, you think, roughly?
Thousands, but beyond that, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I would encourage you to get a brief from the State Department. They have cataloged all of that.
General, as far as the Wagner Group goes, do you know any more specifics on that? Could you shed some light?
Sure, I don't. Again, as Dr. Kahl said, I think the State Department could answer that better. But as you and the rest of the country have seen, we're certainly concerned with what we see reported in the news. And I don't mean to segue, sir, but there was a comment earlier about about Russian atrocities or Russian acts. I think what separates our military, what separates Western military, certainly from the Russians, is our concentration on treating people, the way they should be treated, with dignity, on the laws of armed conflict that Dr. Kahl mentioned. And I know that we work hard to talk to the Ukrainians about the same things.
Is Russia a signature, General? Do you know? Or is it a signature to the Geneva Convention?
Sir, that's a great question.
Just kind of thought about that. I don't know.
So if they are, and even if they weren't, the Geneva Conventions are treated as customary international law, and so binding even on states that don't sign up to them.
And General, is it your professional opinion that the Wagner Group is something you'd be more concerned about because they're not Russian military regulars?
So I think the Wagner Group is given plenty of reason to be concerned. I mean, the fact that they're recruiting members from prisons certainly gives an indication of what kind of character that they're willing to recruit.
General, they say they're not doing that anymore.
Yes, sir.
Should we believe them?
Sir, I'm not sure I would trust the words that are coming from the Russian side right now.
So you're saying, in effect, that authoritarian regimes should not be taken at their word, regardless of whether it's, say, in Beijing or in Moscow?
Sir, I'd agree that we have a system in which I would trust, and they don't have that same.
I hope all members of Congress just heard you. Thank you. I yield back.
Jim's time started. Before we go to the next questioner, I want to remind everybody that we have a hard stop at 12:30 to go to the classified portion of this hearing. Gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden's recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by looking back to May of last year and point out that a bipartisan group of members of Congress, including members of this committee, have sent the administration letters, and that's gone on since April of last year, all the way right up to right now, calling for the supply of advanced military capabilities to Ukraine quite consistently. So 10 months ago, a number of us called for anti-ship missiles, HIMARS, Abrams tanks, as well as training on and transfer of F-16s. About 5 months ago, once again, bipartisan group of members of this committee called for a long-term defense commitment to Ukraine to include surface-to-air missiles, MLRS, anti-ship missiles, howitzers, and again, training on and transfer of advanced aircraft such as the F-16. Now, in my opinion, these letters represent differing opinions, policy opinions, about the speed at which the United States should seek to deliver advanced fighting capabilities to the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, I really appreciate the conversation that's been going on. Just thinking about things such as F-16 or ATACMS or previously Abrams or HIMARS, I think what we have seen is that there are sometimes policy questions and debates and differing opinions. Then there are logistical challenges, maintenance, and the training and capabilities of the Ukrainian fighters themselves, different than policy opinions of a differing nature. And of course, I respect the opinion brought forward by Dr. Kahl about authorizations, appropriations, and how do we get the greatest ROI on the money that you have in hand right now to meet the top priorities of the Ukrainian military. But certainly, given enough money, they would prefer to have their top 5 or top 6 or top 10 needs or capabilities met. And the conversation about authorizations and appropriations is really, I think, a question for Congress, as opposed to questions of policy or logistical concerns and challenges. Now, of course, over the weekend, the President's national security team said now's not the right phase of the war for providing Ukraine advanced aircraft. That sounds like a policy decision. And they have also pointed out that the assessment of military commanders advising the President is that we need to focus on tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles and such. I don't think anyone disagrees with that, sir. And you've articulated really that this is about how much money do we have now, what's the greatest need that they have. But Ukraine has articulated a desire to advance their long-range fighting capabilities in the form of ATACMS and F-16s. So just about over a week ago, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, U.S. European Command, briefed members of Congress, Senate and House reportedly, and said that he believed we should send aircraft, drones, ATACMS to enhance the deep fight capabilities of the Ukrainian military. Setting aside all the concerns about logistics or maintenance or the readiness of the Ukrainian military, General Sims, would you agree with his assessment that this would help Ukraine to win the war ultimately?
Sir, I have no doubt that the continued provision of advanced conventional weapons would help Ukraine on the battlefield, no doubt. And I certainly have been extraordinarily impressed, as most have, with General Cavoli's work in Europe. On this side of the Atlantic, the conversation continues to be around certainly about policy decisions, but in our conversations with the Ukrainians, as recent as yesterday with General Zaluzhny and the chairman, we do hold fast to the view that what they need right now are the things in front of them. That F-16s, as an example, would not help them today, but things like air defense, artillery, fighting vehicles, tanks is what we need to ensure we're providing.
So you don't agree with the EUCOM commander that possession of F-16s and ATACMS and other long-range capabilities would help them to win the war?
No, sir. I think that advanced conventional weapons would help anybody win a war.
Absolutely.
Yes,
is there a policy objection to giving them longer-range fires at this time?
So I think both the F-16s and the ATACMS issues, I think, are slightly different animals.
In general, is there a policy objection?
No, because the F-16s issue is less about a long-range capability. I think there is a general recognition that it will make sense for them over time to transition to fourth-generation aircraft. It's more about the trade-offs. The ATACMS
Just a few more seconds, but just with that, I would just point out, why not expand this conversation beyond the near term and the limits of the dollars that you have in your possession now and come to Congress with a plan that includes near-term, medium-term, and long-term, given that whether they win the war now or it drags on for several more years, the Russian threat will still remain. So I just think we got to expand the conversation.
Happy to brief you on that, and frankly, if you come to the classified session, we can also provide some more details on, because we have done some analysis on kind of the future Ukrainian force and what that might look like.
Thank you. Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Mace, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith, for hosting this very important hearing. I want to thank the gentlemen who are here today, as well to take all of our very important questions. We're here to address a critical matter of national security and foreign policy in regards to Ukraine, the need for oversight of assets, weapons, munitions, and other aid, lethal aid being provided to Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has highlighted the critical need for rapid aid and support that we're providing to that region. The conflict has resulted in heavy losses for both sides, but we've seen the Ukrainian forces, they've demonstrated their resilience and ability to conduct offensive operations, I believe, over the last year to everyone's surprise. There's no price for resiliency and their belief in their freedom and their fight for freedom. They've been on the world stage, I think, have encouraged and inspired many folks around the world. However, their capacity to defend their sovereignty and security is dependent on receiving timely and effective assistance. In particular, we've seen a troubling pattern of delays and bureaucratic hurdles, policy decisions that have slowed the delivery of aid to Ukraine. I've witnessed this firsthand. I've witnessed the State Department slow rolling in some cases, particularly at the beginning of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And it's my belief in the meetings I've had, both publicly and privately, and in the SCIF, that Ukraine just doesn't have a lot of time. And we want to make sure that our investment in their fight, that they're going to win. It's more important than ever, seeing what Russia's trying to do. They want to now take away Poland's borders and other countries. Ukraine can't lose this fight, in my estimation. The situation in Ukraine demands urgent action, a commitment to ensuring the lethal aid and support be provided expeditiously. Congress and DoD need to take the steps to remove any hurdles or address them to ensure the necessary resources are available to fight for Ukraine to fight for its sovereignty and security. Failure to do so would not only endanger Ukraine, but also undermine global stability, global security. And it's my estimation Ukraine is just, I believe, under the gun and just does not have very much time left in this endeavor. My first question is for Undersecretary Kahl. I'm concerned about the time it took for the U.S. to fully leverage some of our existing processes, like convening the Senior Integration Group for Ukraine, SIG Ukraine, to disperse military aid to Ukraine. And thinking ahead, China and Taiwan, we all know that China is watching. Are there any specific improvements you would make to the department's decision-making process to ensure the U.S. is proactively readying this important partner rather than simply reacting with support? Some of the lessons learned, how long did it take to stand up SIG Ukraine? Some of what you learned over the last year in this process.
Thank you for that, and I'll just say we share your sense of urgency. And there's always going to be red tape, but we have blasted through a lot of it. And if you had, I think, told us a year ago that we could have executed on $31.7 billion in security assistance to anybody, I would have said that was bureaucratically impossible. And it's precisely because we tried to blast through as much red tape as possible. Most of that assistance has come through PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, and typically because we pre-position things and get our ducks in a row, a lot of that equipment starts flowing in within days of the president signing the PDA, and Lieutenant General Sims can talk to you more about that. In terms of our internal processes, we have two. We have something called the Cross-Department Working Group, which is essentially the group that my office runs, but it's got stakeholders from all the services, the Joint Staff, the combatant commands, et cetera, to rack and stack Ukrainian priorities and figure out the priorities for various PDA and USAI packages. So that's really about kind of teeing up for the Secretary. Ultimately, there's recommendations that then go over to the White House. We then have the SIG process, which you
How long did it take to stand up the SIG?
You know, I'd have to get back to you on the exact date. I think the SIG was stood up within a couple of months of the.
Is that fast enough, in your opinion?
Well, I think that we've stood up a lot of processes that are new.
Do you think that Taiwan has a couple of months?
We've already have a SIG for Taiwan. So to your point,
stood up and ready to go. So it's all.
It meets monthly, chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Excellent. And then on the working group, their cross-department working group. Is that working better now than it has been before because of the urgency through Ukraine? Have you all learned over the last year how to improve some of the red tape, I guess? What red tape was removed to make it work better, faster, more in this case?
Well, just traditionally, we've not Presidential Drawdown Authority has been used to provide things in the amounts of, hundreds of billions of dollars at the upper end, not tens of billions of dollars. So there was a lot of learning curve. Essentially, what we figured out was to make sure all the stakeholders were involved. You had an iterated process that culminates in a 4-star meeting that I chair about every 10 days, and then that pushes recommendations up to the chairman and the secretary, who then push those recommendations over to the White House.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jackson, for 5 minutes.
General Sims, good afternoon. I was wondering if you could help me paint a picture for my folks back home of what life would look like for Ukrainians were we to step aside, were we to withdraw our support, were the coalition that we lead to crumble upon our withdrawal of our support, and then were the Russians to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield. What that would mean, and I ask you because based on your remarks, you said that the fighting has replicated the conditions that we saw during the First World War. There was a recent conversation about plentiful examples of war crimes that have been committed. And I think it's important for me in explaining my support to folks back home to give them a sense of what it would look like if our effort no longer existed. Could you help me do that, please?
So, sir, I'll leave the geopolitical conversation to what Dr. Kahl was mentioning earlier. And I would tell you a couple things. First would be, as an American, this is what we do. I mean, this is what we do. This is what we've fundamentally done for decades. When people are wronged, we stand up for them. And in this case, the invasion of Russia, everyone has said it was illegal. Everybody says it was wrong. And that's what we do. And in this case, we came together with the allies in Europe in a way that we haven't done, really haven't done in the past 50, 60 years. I mean, so a year ago today, so we talk about a year ago on the 24th was the invasion. A year ago today, I deployed with my division headquarters as a division commander, 1st ID, to Central Europe. And I spent a lot of time in Europe, battalion commander, brigade commander. And so I've worked a number of times with our allies. I had never worked with our allies where the desire, the intent to work together was as firm as it was in the time I was deployed. That has not changed. I've been back multiple times. We were talking earlier about the contributions of our partners. There is more than dollars, I would argue, that is part of this. We have partners that have skin in the game, and so they may not be dedicated dedicating the same percentage of GDP, but in some cases are dedicating individuals who are making critical, really important contributions to what we're doing in terms of security assistance, intelligence, working in terms of advising and training with our partners. That's what we do. We're Americans. And when somebody says this is how the world should be and it's not, we say no. Dr. Kahl has talked about the rules-based order. Why is this important? Because after the Second World War, we came together with the majority of the world and said, this last 5-10 years is not how we wish to live in the world. And we established the geopolitics that exist today. And we need to tell people we need to do something when people go in the wrong direction. Why is it important to Americans? Because we believe in this group in here, sir, in this oversight process. I know politics. I'm an Army guy. No politics. American politics field of study at the Academy. And I would tell you, watching the oversight here, watching what has occurred in D.C., all the way to the young man or woman in Poland who's transitioning that equipment forward, to a Ukrainian who plans to use it, that's what we exist for. That's why it matters, sir.
Now, that last piece I'd like you to expand on. Could you help us visualize what it looks like when we make the decision to send them light tactical vehicles all the way to that material being fielded? Give us a sense of what that process looks like, how quickly it's now moving.
Well, sir, and as Dr. Kahl was talking with Representative Mace earlier, we're learning all sorts of lessons. I mean, listen, where we were a year ago today and where we are now, it's a light year's difference. It's because we have smart, capable men and women who are working to make the processes more effective and efficient. What we have done in terms of moving, it's literally, I'll say literally moving mountains. If you were to stack up all of the things that we have provided, we have literally moved mountains from not just the United States, but from places that we're working with partners around the world. And we have moved that incrementally across oceans, in the air, with hundreds and hundreds of aircraft and ships. Move that to Europe, and then it's moved further by our partners and by men and women that we all are so proud to have there, all the way to a point where a Ukrainian man or woman takes it and brings it forward to use it. And I know a number of you have seen that, sir, but it's pretty impressive.
My time is over. It has been an extraordinary logistical accomplishment on top of other accomplishments.
Sure.
Chair now recognizes our final questioner before we go into classified brief, and that's the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant General Sims, to what degree do the operational plans within DoD rely upon the assumption that we would be only forced to defeat an adversary in one theater and deter an adversary in another theater?
Well, sir, not to jump into the policy side, but I mean that's what we're saying we're doing. Yes, sir.
So given the growing no-limits security partnership between Beijing and Moscow in the years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, can we reasonably argue that planning for a confrontation with only one adversary is becoming an increasingly dangerous presumption?
Sir, I'd argue that the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are having conversations about ways that they can improve their connections is dangerous to all of us as Americans. But I think that the current work that we're doing takes into account where we are around the world.
If Xi Jinping makes the foolish decision of arming Russia with weapons, what is on the table in terms of our response?
Sir, that one I'll definitely leave to Dr. Kahl.
Okay, Dr. Kahl, you can make news here.
So first of all, I don't think China's leadership wants their intentions and plans to be made public. So one of the things we've made clear to them is if we have information that they're doing this, we'll make it public. And this actually, it matters because, as you know, China's on a bit of a charm offensive to get back into the good graces of Europe. That's not going to work, I don't think, period, but certainly not if they're providing large amounts of lethal assistance to Russia. We've also signaled Secretary Blinken with his counterpart at the Munich Security Conference and through other channels that there would be significant costs. I'm happy in the classified session to talk about what some of that might look like, but it would be the similar tools we've used to impose on others that have violated U.S. sanctions.
So we are actively trying to deter the CCP from providing lethal assistance to Russia?
Yes.
And of course, at a broader level, we are actively trying to deter the CCP from invading Taiwan by force, if necessary. I think this is a perfect example. And I know you've talked, well, I just came back from 4 days in Taiwan, and I was struck by all the national security leaders there talked about this increasing strategic convergence between Russia and China. I'm curious if you see it in the same way. It's sort of my contention that increasingly Putin is Xi's junior partner in a de facto alliance against the West, and I think we initially understood the no limits partnership to be a piece of paper, and increasingly it's something real. But I'd love to get your comment on how you see these two problem sets as connected.
Yeah, I think that's insightful and on the money. I think basically, you know, Russia for a long time has not wanted to be China's junior partner. And I think that held alive the dream in Washington that you could drive a wedge between these two actors. I think the war in Ukraine has essentially ended that proposition as realistic in the foreseeable future, because Russia's going to have to turn to China for technology, for economic assistance, to help them reconstitute their military after the war. And they're already turning to them now. But by the way, the same calculus is driving the Russians, to have greater convergence with Iran and North Korea as well. And so I do think because of how attrited the Russian military has been, they have no choice but to you know, move closer to some of these other actors.
Now, you've said recently, I believe, though, that you don't see a PLA invasion of Taiwan as imminent within the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just see no indications that Xi Jinping thinks his military is ready, or that the PLA thinks they're ready. I think he has put a date on the dartboard for them to be ready. That doesn't mean they've made the decision to do it, and that's 2027. I think in the interim period, I do not see indications that they are likely to make a leap to invade the island of Taiwan.
But just so I understand, your assessment is based on the absence of evidence that you don't see an indication that they're getting ready to invade. I guess maybe...
Actually, this would be a really interesting thread of the conversation for us to talk about in the classified setting.
Got it.
Because it's not just about that.
Interesting. Just like did you view, 2 years ago, did you view a Russian invasion of the rest of Ukraine as imminent?
As imminent, I did not. But of course, we had indications and warnings first in April, and then of course in the fall, that it was a possibility. And you know, my assessment is based on the information and intelligence that I have at the moment. If information and intelligence change, then my assessment will be updated.
And so you disagree, I'm out of time, with General Minahan's recent assessment that 2025 is the danger zone?
I do.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. We will start questioning in the classified portion with those members who haven't been recognized for questions in the public portion. So right now we stand in recess for 5 minutes as we move to 2212 for the classified portion of this hearing.